All of New York City was abuzz last spring with talk performance artist Marina Abramovich's controversial retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. Abramovich is famous for her extreme performances that position her body as the medium. The body here becomes a site of mutilation, infliction, and consequently resilience. Abramovich acknowledges that her work throughout the past 4 decades has been used to test the physical limits of the body, her body. This exhibit luckily contained, besides live performers acting out her past pieces, smaller installation screens with recordings of her work. One screen displayed her and her former partner slapping each other with growing intensity and frequency for approximately 20 minutes. Just across the room was footage of Abramovich naked and running repeatedly into a column as people stood around and watched. And actually, her partner, both her partner romantically and in her work, was in this work as well when they were colliding in these walls, but she lasted longer than him. The sounds of her body colliding into the firm wall mixed with the sight of her body's reverberation immediately post-collision are documented acts of self-brutality. They are so vivid that it may be difficult for some, like myself, to watch without feeling a sense of Abramovich's own physical pain. How did Abramovich garner such success through her provocative work? What is the appeal, and why do we, the spectators, stay and watch? Abramovich's work does not stand alone in this question about ostensibly masochistic artistic expression, not only on the part of the performer, but also those watching. In fact, European cinemas of the past few decades offer us a comprehensive body of work fixated on questions of audience's stamina in the face of disturbing imagery and morose narrativity. 3 of the arguably most watched filmmakers who fit within this category are Michael Heneke, Lars von Trier, and Breillat, all still controversial and incredibly prolific. While these directors, all from different countries, have varying ideological and stylistic questions catalyzing their work, they nonetheless are known for making films that mix melodrama and a somewhat new brand of horror, employing themes of rape, psychological and physical torture, and narratively including dismal outcomes for the film's protagonists, or at best ambiguously implying dreadful consequences for the central characters. These films might not be drawing on a literal sexual discourse of masochism with predictable connotations of bondage props and verbal assault. However, they establish a more figurative masochistic dynamic with their audiences, a discourse within proximity to the spectatorship of classical horror films. So I come back to this question, why do we watch? In searching for an answer to this question of potential masochistic spectatorship and viewership, I came across Gilles Deleuze's writing on the subject of masochism. Coldness and Cruelty, a book mostly interested in the structures and themes of masochism as found in Leopold von Sacher-Masoch's famous Venus in Furs, is a diversified study of the phenomenon, drawing on Freudian psychoanalysis, Marquis de Sade's writings, Greek mythology, and even legal theory to analyze its many facets. Deleuze has an almost structuralist approach to masochism in this text, analyzing the method and process in its sexual practice. For Deleuze, the history of this practice is not as much significance as the structures of the complex relationship between victim and torturer, one dictated by contract and expectation. Though Deleuze would go on to write about cinema later in his career, he does not discuss masochism as it relates to film in this text. Nor is Deleuze interested in the reader's positioning within or outside of the text, a relationship that I cannot help but speculate may have interested Deleuze had he written on masochism later in his career. And yet still there is something incredibly revealing about masochism in Coldness and Cruelty, a study that, although it stays within the confines of psychoanalysis to a certain extent, transcends questions of psychological motivations and offers up a more spanning analysis of what may be vernacularly deemed pain-seeking or pain-loving or pain-seeking. Here I want to discuss some of my own thoughts on masochism and film spectatorship with the help of Deleuze's writing. Most writing on masochism, or usually sadomasochism, and film have been done through a predominantly psychoanalytic framework. Cage's Silverman's book, Male Subjectivity at the Margins, is a prime example of this. And while Silverman exhibits her admirable literacy of psychoanalytic theory, the book fails to tell us much about the materiality of masochism, its structures outside the unconscious, and the ways it can open up other discussions about such things as spectatorship. This is precisely my intention here, to link Deleuze's ideas of masochism to the social phenomenon of masochistic film spectatorship. To help illustrate my point, I will refer to Lars von Trier's 2003 film Dogville, an allegory about social hysteria and exercise in spectatorial endurance. Through the work of Gilles Deleuze, I want to focus my discussion by asking the question, how does a violent and disturbing film, arguably not intended to sexually stimulate its viewers, get sexualized through the phenomenological process of spectatorship? And in this process, how does the spectator's masochism, the pleasure and the pain both experienced and endured by the spectator, bleed into the spectator's sadism, the pleasure in watching the pain on the screen? I believe Deleuze's theories provide for cinema crucial links in its own study of masochism, but the cinematic medium also exposes some of the shortcomings of Deleuze's ideas on masochism. This point I will come to later in the paper. So I want to begin with the text, Coldness and Cruelty, because I think Deleuze has a specific agenda in this work. His major assault is on the vernacular assimilation of the term sadomasochism. For Deleuze, sadomasochism is a misnomer, as the two are not ideally congruous. Emphasizing Marquis de Sade and Leopold von Sacher-Masoch's separate writings, Deleuze points out that sadism and masochism derive from disparate literary ideologies. Sadism acts as an attempt to anarchically obliterate institutional law, to subvert it and defy it through violence. Masochism, on the other hand, Deleuze writes, creates a new order and a new law through the use of contract and ritual. Deleuze admits that it is often difficult to find exact formal divides between the two discourses. Masochism usually contains sadism and vice versa, but not as polarized acts dependent on one another. He pointedly states that it would never occur to the sadist to find pleasure in other people's pain if he had not first undergone the masochistic experience of a link between pain and pleasure. The psychoanalytic aspects of Coldness and Cruelty are clearly influenced by Freud, but many of Deleuze's structural observations seem equally, if not more, informed by the writing of Freud's student, Theodor Reich. In defining masochism, Deleuze recalls Reich repeatedly, noting Reich for his thematic breakdown of the phenomenon. Deleuze's broad understanding is that masochism is not the negation of feeling, but rather the disavowal of sensuality. He identifies that for the masochist, pain, punishment, and humiliation are necessary prerequisites to obtaining gratification. These aspects do not come without temporal requirements either, as waiting and suspense are characteristic of the ritual of masochism. Though most are familiar with the basic ideas of masochism, Deleuze's meditation on ritual, contract, and the acts of desexualization and resexualization makes his concepts especially pertinent to the conventions of cinema. Ritual and contract are closely linked in masochism, as Deleuze writes. Contract generates a type of law which leads straight into ritual. Deleuze takes from many of Reich's ideas on the contract, which implies not only the necessity of the victim's consent, but the ability to persuade and his pedagogical and judicial efforts to train his torturer. Though Spectator is obviously not literally training the film as his or her torturer, the contract here is still useful for film studies. The contract between film and viewer, for example, is established not only because the viewer has decided to enter the theater or watch the film, but because the film often sets the rules, and the viewer a code of expectations. With the help of reviews, blogs, and word of mouth, it is necessarily impossible to ignore the controversy surrounding films by directors such as Lars von Trier and Michael Heneke and Captain Breillat. Part of the draw for many filmmakers who went to see Antichrist was its disturbing imagery. They entered into a masochistic contract, though some of them may have broken it upon their exit from the theater mid-screening. Still, for cinephiles, a masochistic relationship is often created with their favorite director's work. Nowhere does contract and ritual play out more complicatedly than in both the diegetic world of Dogville, as well as in the space of the hypothetical masochistic audience. Dogville is a film that seems to have been loosely based on Burton Wilder's Our Town, but an Our Town that is caught in a nightmare. Grace, played by Nicole Kidman, shows up to a small town evading what appears to be law enforcement. After being befriended by Tom Edison, who's played by Paul Bettany, a writer and teacher in the town, Grace works for the townspeople so that they let her stay. Slowly, the police begin showing up to Dogville in search of a woman whose description matches Grace's. The townspeople grow more curious and anxious about this, testing and blackmailing Grace and turning her into an instigator of trouble. After an attempt to escape Dogville, Grace is chained to a large wheel, raped repeatedly by the men in the town, and harassed and assailed by the other citizens. The film ends when Grace's mobster father is phoned by Tom to come get her. When her father arrives, Grace orders him and his gang to burn the town to the ground and kill its townspeople. As I've already implied, there may be a sexual drive motivating one's viewing of a film such as Dogville. To speak of perception as sexualized, it suggests that there is something inherently sexual in watching and viewing, a type of scopophilia, to borrow the psychoanalytic term, that delineates the voyeuristic pleasure of looking. And it may seem that this aligns me with the psychoanalytic theorists that adopted Lacan's theories in the 70s, from Christian Metz to Laura Mulvey to Kaja Silverman. I do agree that there can be something very sexual in the psychological processes of a spectator, but I do not think that this is always the case. In terms of the filmmakers and films I've mentioned, I cannot help but believe that sexuality is central to their appeal. This should not be seen as such a bold statement due to these films' often close proximity to issues of sex and, yes, even sexual repression. Interestingly, the masochistic viewer may go through a similar process as the film upon his or her viewing. There are complications to the apparatus-centric readings of psychoanalytic theorists, but I contend that there may be still some validity in their claims. Spectator and text should not be totally conflated here. However, to eliminate the possibility of psychological, and let us not forget about the body, a physiological dialogue is to negate viewership altogether. In the case of films such as Dogville and Antichrist, the text must be desexualized because to fetishize it, to sexualize it baldly is dangerous. It may be to recognize one's perversion in the face of graphic, often sexual imagery. And so a distance must be attained between the potentially sexualized object, the film, and the spectator. This distance may be attained through a process of desexualization, where a spectator removes sentiment from potentially titillating imagery. A sort of coldness, if you will, is enacted so that the desire becomes displaced. A Freudian might even frame this as a triumph of the superego over the id, a push to desexualize the imagery as a mechanism to keep social convention in the forefront and one's own perverse desires at bay. As Deleuze writes about the psychological process of masochism, he states, desexualization operates with extraordinary coldness, but it is accompanied by a resexualization, which does not in any way cancel out the desexualization, since it operates in a new dimension, which is equally remote from functional disturbances and from subliminations. It is as if the desexualized element were resexualized, but nonetheless retained in a different form, the original desexualization. The desexualized has become in of itself the object of sexualization. Deleuze profoundly illustrates that coldness informs the transformation from desexualization to resexualization. In a 1984 interview, Michel Foucault also mentions desexualization vis-a-vis the physical play of sadomasochism. Immediately before he says this, he states that sadomasochism presents a new eroticization of the body. Both Foucault and Deleuze, sadomasochism, or just masochism for Deleuze, of course, is understood as sexual, but in a way vastly different than other fetishes are conceptualized. Pleasure comes from, as Foucault puts it, strange parts of the body in very unusual situations, suggesting sadism and masochism engage corporeality beyond conventional understandings of sexuality, that is, beyond genitalia and perhaps what is even physically possible. So how does the filmic get resexualized in order to constitute an overall masochistic viewing experience? It is my sense that the haptic becomes an element that overcomes the desire to desexualize, to reanimate the matter for resexualization. Many film scholars have argued film is a haptic medium, but is ironically left out in discussions of sexuality in cinema too often. As scholar Antonio Lant recounts the writings of Walter Benjamin, she suggests that for early cinema, the shock effect of the bombardment of spectators by images was physical. She concludes with a description of film as it was a new form, stating, bodies now at the cinema lie and lounge, have their entrails rummaged, are bombarded and physiologically massaged by the radicality of film's spatial and temporal propositions. Even within a contemporary milieu, I would not make any adjustments to Lant's assertion about spectator corporeality. Cinema's engagement of the body in this way, especially when the subject matter is of violent and antisocial nature, suggests that there is a resexualization of the body as it responds to the almost tactile imagery presented on screen. I suggest that this also captures the inevitable phenomenological component within spectatorship. As Vivian Sobchak discusses the lived body in her book, The Address of the Eye, A Phenomenology of Film Experience, she states that because of phenomenology, we begin to understand film through postural, motor, and spatial practices as they are lived both interceptively and objectively. Sobchak poetically acknowledges both the body and consciousness of spectator, describing the dialogue between film and spectator as here where the body touches, and then as here where the world is sensible, here where I am. In this vein, masochism is given a space that exists outside just the bodies as they are depicted on screen, but because it is fused into the formal devices of moving image, it simultaneously acts on our bodies. Through something like the torture in Michael Heneke's Funny Games, or in slave bondage in Dogville, what I would call body association is simulated through the horrific acts portrayed on screen. Dogville delivers these especially haptic and phenomenological moments at the same time that it presents the most obvious allusion to the physical play of sadomasochism with its use of props. After attempting an escape from town, Grace is chained with the town dog's leash to a large metal wheel so that she cannot leave. Additionally, the bell that was previously on the dog is attached to her neck so that the townspeople know if she moves abruptly. For a significant portion of the film, Grace must drag the heavy weight around. The wheel scratching on the ground is audible throughout her movements, and in one scene, in a distinctively haptic moment, Grace drags the wheel through a freshly fallen snow. We see her trail as the wheel takes the snow along as if it were a shovel. I emphasize these images and sounds because they represent for the spectator an attempt to create body association that parallel Grace's physical strain. It is not enough to just show her as a slave. The weight becomes central to the shots and camera movements as Grace taxingly mobilizes throughout the town. The haptic as an interlocution between desexualization and resexualization may enact the body's participation, yet it only begins to constitute the masochistic experience. For Deleuze, the use of repetition is central to the process. In Dogville, we watched Grace cyclically abused. This is expressed in the form of montage that reveals Grace's torture. About repetition, Deleuze writes, "In sadism and masochism, there is no mysterious link between pain and pleasure. The mystery lies in the desexualization process, which consolidates repetition at the opposite pole to pleasure, and in the subsequent resexualization makes the pleasure of repetition seemingly proceed from the pain." This quote may indicate that although pleasure does not exist in the initial act, as this is the moment of desexualization, the pleasure arrives with repetition originating from the pain. In the context of Dogville, the repetition is not perfectly symmetrical. The narrative structure places the spectator in the role of the masochist as Grace simply plays out the role of the tortured. The pleasure does not come from watching Grace violated in several ways, rather comes in the ritualistic position of viewing a film horrific in its character's behavior, its many characters' behavior, not Grace's.
Had Grace had friends in Dogville, they too fell like the leaves. Most townspeople of the male sex now visited Grace at night to fulfill their sexual needs. It had occurred to the children to give the bell an extra ring every time such an act had been consummated, much to Martha's confusion. But since the chain had been attached, things had become easier for everyone. The harassments in bed did not have to be kept so secret anymore because they couldn't really be compared to a sexual act. They were embarrassing in the way it is when a hillbilly has his way with a cow, but no more than that. Tom saw everything. It pained him, and the sexual visits were a particularly severe blow.
Good night.
But he supported her as best he could, the way a spider supports when it has been tangled in its own web by the wind.
One could argue, however, that Dogville is an exercise in not only a director's sadism, but also our own. When Grace is first raped, it is shot in an almost sadistic way. As the rape occurs, the film edits between various angles on the event through the transparent imaginary houses of the townspeople. As Grace is assaulted, we see the townspeople go about their daily routines. Though Grace's body at this point has become more or less become a signifier for slavery, this is of compulsory and overexerted labor, this moment creates a change in how her body is utilized visually. She is violated, and the multi-perspectival shots on the incident connotes a cruelty and maybe even a coldness that relegates the audience a kind of perpetrator. Deleuze's aim to divorce sadism and masochism to prove they are not dialectical is complicated here, and is strangely within his temporary acknowledgement of dialectics, that there may be an ironic support for sadism and masochism's interdependence. As he describes the roles of torture and victim as dialectical, he explains dialectic does not simply mean the free interchange of discourse, but implies transpositions and displacements of this kind, resulting in a scene being enacted simultaneously on several levels, with reversals and repudiations in the allocation of roles and discourses. As indicated by Deleuze, reversals are eminently possible within the play of masochism. All roles are subject to instability. I think this is true of sadism's relationship with masochism as well, as there's always a chance for one to bleed into the other. Part of the phenomenological experience of the film Spectator may be that film and spectator are often reversing roles, transposing the sadism and masochism from scene to scene or even moment to moment. The end of the film also signals this separation's near impossibility. When Grace's father and his gang rescue her, she finally realizes the malevolence inherent in the townspeople of Dogville. It is then that she turns into a sadist by having the whole town destroyed. In her father's car, Grace tells him to do the kids first and make the mother watch. Do in this case refers to kill, as it is her way to take revenge on one of the characters for smashing her beloved figurines and making her watch. The importance in this narrative event is that if the hypothetical masochistic spectator did not experience pain throughout the film, it is in Grace's revenge that the two unite. In what seemed like a triangulation of sadomasochism, the protagonist and viewer merge in this moment to turn the tables on a town that took no pity on a vulnerable guest. Their villainy becomes her own, and Grace annihilates the order and contract established between town and her, the spectator and the protagonist. Not everyone has the same reactions to films by such directors as Lars von Trier, Breillat, or Michael Heneke, for example. The discomfort that their films often elicit is certainly a subjective observation, but this paper has mostly tried to identify aesthetic and narrative efforts to have audiences squirm and maybe even depart the theater. It is in the haptic qualities of cinema that masochistic desire is given a place to explore subjects socially taboo. Whether through the jump cuts or lingering shots in Dogville, the screen becomes a textured site where spectators are invited to test their tolerance for the palpable suffering in the film. Again, it is Deleuze that emphasizes the use of the contract in masochism. The spectator enters into a contract, desexualized as it may be, and resexualizes the film-spectator relationship through a sense of haptic ritual. For Foucault, this may be directly tied to an eroticized interest in power relations. Similarly, the film does establish a power relation with the spectator. The Vivian subject reminds us of the body's agency. We can not ignore a process that demands of us something as simple as the instructions to sit and watch. To be present in and of itself is a vital part of the masochistic contract, and filmmakers who love the idea of audiences squirming in their chairs, well beyond the classic horror sense of it, may play the role of torturer in an often sadistic scenario. But it is not this simple. Grace, for example, in Dogville, is able to take back her corporeal agency. It is in her passage from agency to sadism, in our potential to align ourselves with her, that this idea becomes complicated. It is us that witness her prolonged abjection, becoming almost complicit in it, being forced to watch her endure the terror she did not deserve. Then again, isn't this the contract we made by deciding to watch the film in the first place?